MBTI in the U.S. population, we tend to be an extroverted country. 75% of us prefer extroversion, getting our energy from interactions with other people. We tend to be sensors. We like getting our information from our five senses. If we can't see it, smell it, taste it, touch it, or hear it, we don't believe it exists. The only count on which gender skews is the point of judgment. Those men, 2/3 of all men tend to make their judgments based on objective criteria through thinking, and 2/3 of women tend to make their decisions based subjectively. And I'll refer to them as feelers. The point of judgment and perception, again, is about 50-50. But STJ types, which are the sensing, thinking, judging types, tend to predominate in all cultures, which is very interesting and shows that this is a global phenomenon. Well, think about the typical MBTI of the American home cook. She's probably extroverted, 75% of the population is. She's probably a sensor, likes getting her information from her senses. She is probably a she. If you believe the UCLA study of those 80% of women cooking at home, it is still predominantly women, so she's probably a feeler. And it leads us to our other secret of innovating, which is to find a need and fill it. We're going to come back to the MBTI stuff in a minute, but first we're going to talk a little bit about the global evolution of recipes.
And what we did for Becoming a Chef, our first book, is we really wanted to take a look at the history of cooking in restaurants. We'll really focus just on this slide of the history of recipes and cookbooks. And cookbooks go back to the 16th century. Recipes have been only published for the last 500 years. And so we wanted to start really with three
cookbooks.
Yes, sorry, we're going to focus on 3 cookbooks, and the first one's going to be Amelia Simmons' American Cookery, the first cookbook written by an American for an American, and we figured we're here in Portland, so let's start there. And let's just take a look at her recipe. I think this is great. You'll see she has a couple of things that are measured out. 1 quart, she measures out the cream, she measures out the eggs, but then you slip down and you'll see that there's no measurements for a lot of the spices that are in this, and it's just a little too far for me to see.
The sugar, the mace, the nutmeg, the ginger, it's all left seasoned to taste.
Yeah, so that's up to the cook at that point in time. And so next we have the American Evolution recipes, where we're 100 years later, now we have Fannie Farmer, also known as the Boston Cooking School Cookbook, which is the first book to really put into place the measurements. And if you take a look at this page, you'll see that not only is she really saying exactly half a cup of molasses, 2 cups, or 1.5 teaspoons of salt, she's taking all the guesswork out. There's no more rounded teaspoons, there's no more guesswork, there's no pinch of this or pinch of that. And the other thing she does is make her recipes pretty short and sweet, so a little ahead of the game there.
So Fannie Farmer was really obsessed with accuracy, and I don't know that the implication of how much that has changed recipes today. You see the difference between Amelia Simmons and Fannie Farmer is night and day. It's not leaving things to the individual cook. Here in America, we've adapted that Fannie Farmer recipe style as the status quo that continues today of the exact measurements and the precise directions. And I think that we gained a lot by that, but we also lost something, and I think it's important to acknowledge it. We gained the replicability that Andrew had said was so important in recipes, to be able to recreate a dish that's been successful and to give it to someone else who can then recreate what our intention was. But what we lost was that sense of freewheelingness that, as Anne Willan says in her wonderful book, Great Cooks and Their Recipes, that is part of the French spirit and part of other cultures where they rarely measure ingredients but rather rely on experience and flair in putting them together. So if you think about recipes, a recipe is a person. And we're going to go back to the MBTI as I promised. What would you say a recipe is? I would argue that a recipe is self-contained. It's very introverted that way. It's definitely based on the senses. We're going to tell you what to do and how to do it based on things that you can feel and touch. It's really objective and it's very structured. So there is an MBTI of a recipe. What we've identified is what we call the recipe gap, which is who is not being optimally served by the status quo of Fannie Farmer recipes. And what we would argue is that the extroverts are not being served, that the intuitives are being underserved, and that the feelers, so 67% of women, primary audience, are being underserved. So how do we close the recipe gap and serve the underserved? Well, what Andrew and I did, we would argue, is really looked at those intuitives. And we may not think that the minority really matters. It's only 25%, so what? Who cares? Well, of 300 million Americans, that's an audience of 75 million people, including the two of us, coincidentally, who prefer using intuition and are being underserved by recipes. So cooks who prefer intuition are better served by non-recipe recipes with maximum flexibility and by freewheeling, imaginative, and open-ended ideas that allow them to do their own thing. And that's exactly what happened with 1996, exactly 100 years later, we came out with Culinary Artistry, which was the first cookbook reference of compatible flavors and really allowed the user to get inspired by compatible flavor combinations and to use it to create their own dishes. Now, one of the other secrets to innovating that we'll point out is that you have to balance impatience with the status quo with patience, that it does take a lot of time to effect change. And there's 3 stages of innovation. It doesn't happen overnight. Innovation, adoption, and diffusion. The innovation is introduced to the market, it's either adopted or rejected, and hopefully eventually it is accepted and it is diffused to become just a matter of course. Well, with our book Culinary Artistry, which came out in 1996, it was largely ignored by the media. It did not get nominated for a single award. The period of adoption was very lengthy, a decade long, from 1996 to 2006, we'd say, where there was simply passionate word of mouth among its readers, especially rising star professional chefs who got it and embraced it and used it to come up with their menus. The diffusion, we would argue, has really come within the last few years, that there have been changes. As readers achieve their own followings, they turn them on to their most used cookbook, which happened to be Culinary Artistry. So in 2006, we literally a month after Ruth Reichel's Gourmet magazine had named Alinea America's #1 restaurant, Grant Achatz was interviewed by Chicago Magazine and named Culinary Artistry very publicly as his most used cookbook. About 6 months later, Top Chef came out and interviewed its 15 contestants of the year about their 3 favorite cookbooks, which included Culinary Artistry as #2, again giving visibility to everybody watching Top Chef at home.
Beat them, Michael.
To what was being read. So I think with the what the turning point, why we're celebrating 2008 as a turning point, is that when the cookbook store in Toronto was interviewed on their occasion of their 25th anniversary, of the 6,000 titles they carried, they mentioned Culinary Artistry was one of the 10 titles that home cooks needed to have. And again, you see that as evidence of the diffusion. So when the Flavor Bible came out, it was basically picked up where Culinary Artistry had left off and had progressed very slowly to come up with a book that listed the herbs, spices, and other seasonings that would best enhance any ingredient that could serve as a starting point for creativity, along with other inspirations for creativity like cuisines and seasonality and so forth. So with the Flavor Bible, it's really happened a lot more quickly. It came out in the fall of 2008. There was immediate coverage because all those people, all the readers who had read Culinary Artistry were able to adapt quickly. There was media coverage that went on an ongoing basis. And I think the huge change is people like Amy Sherman with their wonderful blog, Cooking with Amy, and all the other incredible bloggers out there who are so unbelievably influential as these markets continue to segment and getting the word out, creating more readers as to how to use a particular book. So one of the secrets that we can talk about, do we have time to go into that? Okay.
5 minutes or so.
5 minutes. So is to look to other creative realms for inspiration. I think we should probably skip.
We're going to skip it.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, we have more for next time.
So we're going to look, for the intuitives in the group, to another area of creativity for inspiration.
So we're going to take a quick look at the song Louie Louie, came out a few decades ago.